What if what you feel is not a weakness, but simply another way of being alive? Welcome to the Highly Sensitive People channel. Here to help you understand yourself better, embrace who you are, and truly flourish. If this resonates with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. There is a question that art history asks without ever really answering. Why do some works touch us so deeply? Why do some paintings, some symphonies, some novels make us feel seen, truly seen, across centuries? The answer perhaps lies in a single word: sensitivity. Sensitivity, that rare, neurobiologically documented ability to process the world with an intensity and depth that most brains cannot naturally reach. This way of perceiving more, feeling more, connecting elements that others do not yet see as linked. The greatest artists in human history, painters, composers, writers, filmmakers, have often shared this fundamental trait. Many have described an inner life of an intensity that overwhelmed them, an overflowing sensory relationship with the world, an empathy so deep that it hurt. What we today call hypersensitivity. In this documentary, we will travel through eras and artistic disciplines to explore how this neurological trait, so often experienced as a burden, was at the origin of some of the greatest masterpieces humanity has ever produced. Painting. Look at Van Gogh's swirls, not as stylistic choices, but as sensory relationships, as the way a hypersensitive brain actually sees the sky, not stable and uniform, but alive, pulsing, charged with an energy that others barely perceive. Vincent van Gogh described color as an emotion, light as a living presence. He wasn't looking for a style. He was looking to faithfully transcribe what his nervous system perceived. And what his nervous system perceived was of an intensity that canvases, despite everything, still struggle to contain. Frida Kahlo painted her own entrails in the literal sense. Her self-portraits are maps of physical and emotional pain, transformed into symbols so universal that the whole world recognizes itself in them. She didn't paint what she saw, she painted what she felt from inside her body. Edvard Munch described the experience that gave birth to the scream. I felt an infinite scream pass through nature. This is not a literary metaphor. It is the testimony of a brain that perceives atmospheres with a sensory acuity that most people cannot imagine. Monet, obsessed with the same water lilies at all hours of the day, all seasons, all lights. Schiele, whose every line seems drawn under electrical tension. All saw what others looked at without seeing, and they spent their lives trying to sublime it. Classical music. How could Beethoven compose the Ninth Symphony, one of the most powerful works ever written, while being totally deaf? The answer is perhaps in the question itself. Perhaps hypersensitive people don't hear music with their ears, they hear it with their whole being. And when the ears go quiet, the inside continues to vibrate. Beethoven heard music from within with an intensity that deafness could not reach. His symphonies are not arrangements of sounds. They are architectures of pure emotions, joy, pain, exaltation, peace, rendered in all their depth by a man who had felt them with an intensity that few human brains reach. Chopin was known for his terror of public concerts, not for lack of talent, but because the presence of an audience overwhelmed him emotionally and physically. He preferred to play by candlelight for a few close friends in the silence of the night. It was under these conditions that he created some of the most moving nocturnes ever composed. Tchaikovsky described his own compositions as emotional states that he could not express. Erik Satie had designed his whole life around sensory regulation, same apartment, same suit, same absolute silence, to be able to create in conditions that allowed him to access depth. What classical music offered them was a language when they didn't have the words. Literature. There is in Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time a scene that almost everyone knows, even without having read the novel. A Madeleine dipped in tea triggers an avalanche of sensory and emotional memories that spans thousands of pages. This is not a literary device. It is the precise description of what hypersensitive people experience. This way, in which an ordinary sensory stimulus can trigger a memory and emotional response of extraordinary intensity and richness. Proust lived in a cork-lined room to isolate himself from the noise of Paris. He only went out at night. He had built a protective sensory envelope around himself that allowed him to dive into the depths of his own memory. And from there, in this silence and protection, he wrote one of the most vast and profound works of world literature. Virginia Woolf invented the stream of consciousness, this narrative technique that reproduces on the page the incessant movement of a brain that processes everything simultaneously, that perceives and feels without stopping. These novels do not tell stories from the outside, they live them from the inside in all their sensory and emotional complexity. Kafka described in his diaries a sensitivity to noise, to expectations, to atmospheres that corresponds point by point to the modern testimony of hypersensitive people. Rilke described beauty as something almost unbearable. They all wrote from that place, from the depth. Poetry. Poetry is perhaps the most naturally hypersensitive art form that exists. It does not tell, it evokes. It does not describe, it makes you feel. It does not name emotions, it creates them directly in the reader's body. Arthur Rimbaud was 16 when he wrote works that changed French poetry forever. 16 years old, his synesthetic perception, this way of seeing colors in vowels, of hearing light, of tasting words, is one of the most precise descriptions ever given of a hypersensitive brain in peak creative functioning. Charles Baudelaire defined his entire life by this notion of spleen, this hypersensitivity to the world that oscillates between ecstasy and horror, that feels everything at once, that does not know how to live in a world made for more resilient nervous systems. Paul Verlaine sought in his poems music before all else. This priority given to sensation over sense, to feeling over meaning, is at the heart of hypersensitive perception. Emily Dickinson wrote 1,800 poems from her room. They all did the same thing. They transformed intensity into language, and in doing so, they gave others, us, words for experiences that did not yet have them. Contemporary music. Contemporary music has produced some of its most moving moments through artists whose hypersensitivity was both the source of their genius and the condition of their fragility. Kurt Cobain described in his diaries a sensitivity to noise, to crowds, to the emotions of others that made fame literally unbearable. His lyrics speak of margins, of exclusion, of empathetic pain for those society leaves behind, with an acuity that does not come from intellectual reflection, but from the visceral feeling of a hypersensitive person who absorbs the suffering of the world. Nick Drake recorded his albums in conditions of absolute silence and solitude, unable to play in public, unable to bear the presence of more than a few people. His music is of a fragility and beauty that seem to come from an inner space that few people have ever visited. Amy Winehouse wore her emotions with total transparency. Her voice was a direct transcription of what she felt, without filter, without distance, without protection. Tom York of Radiohead composes from a state of anxiety and hypersensitivity to the contemporary world that he has transformed into a highly recognizable musical aesthetic. What they share, an inability to feel halfway, and an ability to transform this totality into music that others recognize as true, because it is, in fact, truth. Cinema. Andrei Tarkovsky said that cinema was the sculpting of time. This definition is not that of a technician or a storyteller. It is that of someone who perceives time itself as a sensory material, who feels it differently from others, who sees its texture and density where most see only a succession of events. His films, The Mirror, Stalker, Andrei Rublev, are experiences of pure perception. They do not tell stories in the conventional sense. They create states. They induce ways of seeing, of feeling, of inhabiting time and space. It is the work of someone who cannot not perceive the depth of every moment. Ingmar Bergman explored human inner states all his life: existential anxiety, guilt, love and its impossibilities, death and its constant presence in daily life. His films are portraits of hypersensitive people confronted with a world that cannot always contain them. Terrence Malick edits his films like visual streams of consciousness, sensations, fragments, impressions that accumulate without strict narrative logic, but with total emotional coherence. These filmmakers understood something essential. Cinema is not made to tell, it is made to make you feel. And to make you truly feel, you must first have truly felt. Dance and body art. There is an art form where hypersensitivity cannot hide behind a canvas or a blank page. An art form where the body itself is the instrument, where what the dancer feels becomes immediately and totally visible. Václav Nijinsky, the absolute genius of early 20th century ballet, described his experience of dance as a dissolving of the boundary between himself and the music, between his body and space. His diaries bear witness to a sensory and emotional perception of an intensity that eventually overwhelmed him completely. Isadora Duncan rejected classical ballet and its rigid codes to invent a dance that started from emotion, that let the inside dictate the movement rather than the movement dictate the inside. It is a revolution that can only come from someone whose nervous system naturally resists formal constraint and seeks authentic expression. Pina Bausch created her Tanztheater by questioning her dancers about their memories, their fears, their most intimate desires, then building choreographies from these raw materials. Her work is a systematic exploration of the human interior, made visible by the body. Dance for these artists was not an art of movement. It was an art of inner truth and the only honest way to live with an intensity that words sometimes can no longer contain. Van Gogh, Proust, Beethoven, Woolf, Kahlo, Rimbaud, Tchaikovsky, Pina Bausch, Cobain. Centuries, cultures, different disciplines, and yet the same invisible thread connecting them all. This way of feeling the world with an intensity that most human brains cannot reach or cannot bear. This deep processing of every experience, of every sensation, of every emotion. This empathy so vast that it becomes almost unbearable. This perception so fine that it captures what others do not yet see. What we today call hypersensitivity. Many of these artists suffered. Many sought, sometimes desperately, ways to live in a world that was not made for their nervous system. Some did not manage to make it through their own intensity. But all without exception, left something behind. A painting, a symphony, a novel, a film, a dance, a photograph, something that says to those who encounter it, you are not alone in feeling this strongly. It is here, in this work, that you can recognize yourself. Perhaps that is, in the end, the deepest function of hypersensitive art. Not just to be beautiful, not just to be powerful, but to be a mirror for those who feel too strongly and who believed they were alone. You are not alone. We are together. Let us know in the comments which hypersensitive artists touch you the most and your favorite works among all those created by these extraordinary beings. Take care of yourself.